Authors Over 50, Writing in Life's Sweetest Third. Authors Over 50's weekly podcast celebrates writers and their journeys to publication. Writing after 50 is a whole story on its own, so let's skip to life's sweetest third and talk with authors about their journey from pen to publish. Welcome. I'm Julia Daly, your host, and I invite you to listen to interviews with writers who've achieved their goal of publishing a book just later in life. We've seen award lists for under 30 or under 40, but I've yet to see lists for those who've achieved a significant milestone of their own, launching a new career and publishing their first book after the age of 50. We will hear about these authors' inspirations, struggles, strategies, and the smell of that first book. These writers' journeys inspire me because I'm one of them. My guest today and his wife have lived extraordinary lives of ministry. Once described as mavericks, they literally stepped out into the unknown to embrace God's call and experience His presence in a way that only comes through a life of obedience. Whether planting and pastoring churches, traveling the world to perform concerts, building a house in Mexico, traveling from village to village in India, or walking across America, they have followed God's voice as He led them forward, one step at a time. Welcome to Authors Over 50, Rick McKinney.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here today.
I can tell the answer from your resume, Rick, but our opening question on Authors Over 50 is always, what took you so long to write your first book?
Well, I really had no intention of writing a book. I pastored most of my life. My wife and I traveled around the world in ministry, and I never really thought too much about writing a book. But after we walked across America in 2006, it was such an unbelievable experience that as we began to share the stories everywhere we went, people kept saying, "You ought to write a book. You ought to write a book." And so my wife had journaled very carefully during the 6 months of our walk. She had written down the name of every person we met, every conversation we had, and then she kept a logistical book with all the mile markers and landmarks and all that sort of thing. And so I took those two journals and I started trying to make her notes into stories, but I didn't really have a passion for it, and I really didn't think I could write. I had started back to school a year after the walk to work on a master's degree, and the first paper I turned in, the professor turned it back to me. It looked like somebody had blood all over it, and he said, "Boy, you can't write." But he said he happened to be an author, and he said, if you'll pay attention and you'll let me help you, I'll teach you how to write. And so I began to write a little bit, wrote a few blogs, a few newsletter posts, that sort of thing. And over 17 years, I worked on the book, and I would rewrite it. Jane would look at it. She would read it and correct it and said, "I'm not sure it happened exactly like that sort of thing." And finally, a year ago, December, I stepped away from the pulpit for the first time in over 50 years, had a little extra time on my hands, and Jane said, "You really have got to finish that book." And so last May, we published it, and it has just been an extraordinary journey. I never dreamt that I would begin to write books, but I have, and it's just been awesome. So that's what took so long.
Well, you're representing both you and your wife, Jane, today. She's your partner in ministry, which is marvelous that y'all get to work together in a cause in which you believe so strongly. I myself went on medical dental missions to Honduras every summer for 10 years, so I know how rewarding those ministries can be. And we as givers receive as much joy as the gifted.
Yes, absolutely. And my wife is such an integral part of everything we do. We've been married this June will be 50 years, and we've been together for 52 years. We met the second week of our freshman year in college, and we've been together ever since. And to be honest with you, I would never have completed the walk across America had it not been for my wife. She was an encourager. She walked hurt and injured most of the way across America, but she kept encouraging me to walk. And so we walked every step, 2,770 miles together. We didn't tag team it. We walked about 20 miles a day, 6 days a week. And it's been like that our whole ministry. Had it not been for her, I always tell people the best part of getting me is getting her. She is more spiritual, a greater faith person, a better prayer on just about every level of spirituality. She is my superior, and I give her all the credit that she's due because she keeps me going. She really does.
Well, you're inspiring all of us today, and you gave me cold chills when you talked so beautifully about your wife. So thank you for loving her so much and for your ministry together. And I want to know a little bit more about the logistics of that walk. To walk 2,000 miles, how did you plan it out? Where did you stay? You said you walk 20 miles a day, and I ride that on a bike every day, but it's an e-bike. So it's not like walking it. So tell us a little bit more about the technicalities of that walk.
Well, we weren't athletes in any way. We were in Baxter Springs, Kansas, teaching at a little college there. And I was preaching that week on Joshua chapter 1. And I read the verse, Joshua chapter 1, verse 3, that says, every place you put the sole of your foot, you can claim. And I heard a voice. It sounded audible to me. I don't know whether anyone else would have been able to hear it or not had they been in the room, but the voice said, do you believe that? And so God and I started this conversation, and it wound up with me saying, yes, I believe the principle that every place you put the sole of your foot, you can claim. And God said, well, what do you want to claim? And I said, our nation. And he said, then put your foot down. I said, where? He said, what do you want to claim? I said, all of it. And he said, then from one side to the other. Took me a couple of weeks to get the courage to break that to my wife, but we made a commitment right away to begin preparation. So we prepared for a year. We started walking a mile and then 2 miles and up to 10 miles a day. We visited shoe stores and talked to other people who'd done long distance walking. We actually drove the entire route the year before and mapped out where we would walk. Our plan was to walk Route 66 from Los Angeles to Oklahoma City, which was halfway. And then we wanted to get to Washington, D.C. So 66 goes north towards Chicago. And so from Oklahoma City, we walked basically the I-40 corridor over to Bristol, Tennessee, and then up through Virginia. We had, because we were traveling in full-time evangelism, we had a camper. So we had planned the year before where we would camp each week. We would camp in the middle of the 120 miles we were going to walk that week. And then we had volunteer drivers who came from all over the country, most of whom we never knew before the walk. But they started talking about the walk on K-Love Radio and Moody Radio and putting in newspapers. We did television interviews, and people started calling us, how can we help? And I said, well, if you can come and drive for us for a week, our support vehicle, that'd be great. So basically the way it worked, Julia, was on Monday morning, our drivers would drive our support vehicle backward 60 miles. And we would walk 20. They would pick us up at the end of the day and take us back to the campground. Then on Tuesday morning, they would drive us out to where we stopped on Monday evening, about 40 miles. We'd walk 20 miles. And then starting on Thursday, we would go the other direction. When we were done walking on Saturday, we'd pack everything up, take the camper 120 miles down the road, and then do it all over again. So that's how we did it. We had a vehicle within 3 or 4 miles. We had walkie-talkies. They had extra shoes and socks and rain gear and all the logistical stuff we needed. And that's how it worked. We made friends that are still our friends this much later, people who came and drove for us, who just were the dearest people in the world. We couldn't have done it without those support drivers. They didn't help us walk, but many times they walked with us. Pastors all across the country wanted to walk with us a day or two, but 90% of the time, it was just Jane and I. And people want to know what you talk about when you walk 20 miles. We prayed mostly. It was the world's longest prayer walk. We prayed for every church we walked by. When you pass those little white crosses on the road, when you do that at 60 miles an hour, you think about it for a second. When you're walking, you see it a half a mile ahead of time. And so when you get to that little white cross with a teddy bear that's attached to it. You pray for the families. And we stopped and prayed with people, had conversations with people. We stopped in many, many churches and prayed with the pastor. It's just an amazing prayer journey and physical journey and spiritual journey. We learned so much. We learned to depend on the Lord and to depend on each other more than we ever had in our life. Jane often says, I wish we were as close to the Lord now as we were during that walk. But when you're counting on him for every step, it produces a kind of faith that sometimes everyday life doesn't.
Well, I had a pastor one time, and every time something wonderful was spoken like that, he would say, that will preach. So I think with just what you just said will definitely preach. Well, I can only imagine how many people the two of you inspired along the way. That's just an incredible journey, and I want to read the book and hear more about it. But once you wrote this manuscript and got it finished, how did you proceed? Did you search for an agent, decide to choose a hybrid, a small press, or did you self-publish?
We looked into a lot of different possibilities. I have a good friend who was actually my advisor during my doctoral program, and he is published over 70 books. And so I talked to him at great length, and he said, Rick, I have to tell you, he said, the future is self-publishing. He said, it's very, very difficult to find an agent, and it's very difficult for an agent to find a publisher. And if you find a publisher, the proceeds from that are very, very slim, unless you're a big name author who has millions of readers. So we decided to self-publish. That was best for us at our age. We didn't want to take 10 years after 17 years to write it. We didn't want to take 5 or 10 more to try to get it published. And that worked well for us. It has worked wonderfully for us. And it kind of lit a fire in me. We've published about 5 books since last May, and it's been wonderful. We took the book and made a children's book out of it. We said, this story is too exciting not to publish it for children. So we hired an illustrator. We cut it down to about 35 pages or so, 40 pages, simplified the story a bit, and we published it as well. And we have raised the money over the last couple of months to put 500 of those copies into pediatricians' offices and children's hospitals. And so every time we get an opportunity, we're sending those out to pediatricians and saying, would you put this in your waiting room? Because the 5 or 10 minutes that they're waiting, or 15 or 20, it's about a 15-minute read. So the children will have time. Then there's a sticker in the back that tells them if they'd like to get a copy, where to. And also a specialized email address, Rick and Jane's Big Adventure. And they can write us with questions like you've asked, where did you stay at night? What did you eat? That sort of thing. So it's a great conversation between us and children who have read the book. So we did that. And then we wrote a book on witnessing. I actually wrote a little 30-page book first, and that took off so well. We've actually used that as a kind of a freebie, and we've given away on Amazon about 3,000 copies of that book, and encourage people to get the follow-up book, which is the whole book on Until the Whole World Knows. The subtitle is A Guide to Sharing Jesus for the Introvert, Extrovert, and Jesus Freak. So the first part is about all different kinds of ways of witnessing without ever saying a word. And then it progresses from there. So that one, we wrote a couple of Christmas books, The Adventure of Advent, and then a Christmas short story. And so we're just writing all the time now. I write 2 different blogs, and I've just found a kind of a second career. I teach college 4 days a week, but besides that, most of my time I'm writing.
Well, that's wonderful, because writing that first book really did light a fire under you. You've become quite prolific. And we have so many options today. And I've talked and interviewed so many people who are self-publishing, which has become, the way to go for a lot of people. And even if they go with a big 5, they're still required to market their own books and to do a lot of the legwork. Have you found anything that's worked as far as getting the word out there, other than leaving books in pediatricians' offices?
Well, lots of things. I've been on about 35 or 40 podcasts now all over the world. I've done three in Nigeria, three in England, New Zealand, uh, Canada. It's been amazing. And so that has helped. And as I said, I publish a blog and we have a website, a lot of word of mouth, Facebook. We haven't done a lot of paid advertising. We're not rich folks, and so we have tried to do as organically as possible. We're also speaking in churches about the walk, and we all have a table afterwards with our books on it, and so that's been really good for direct sales. We just actually signed a deal with Kroger supermarkets that have a wonderful new program for authors, and authors can set up a table in Kroger and do book signings right there. And so we hope to begin that soon. We've been approved and our books are registered now. So we'll be doing that soon. They do that in Texas, by the way, at Kroger stores. And so it's quite interesting. We've done some book signings at libraries, that sort of thing. So we're trying to do as much as we can marketing wise without spending a ton of money. It's easy to spend thousands and thousands of dollars marketing your book. And really for us, the important part is that people read the story. I recorded the audiobook, something I'd never done before. I did it all myself, and it turned out wonderfully, and that's been successful. And so we're just trying to get the story out there because it is a very, very inspiring story.
Well, these podcasts do reach all around the world, and the sole of your foot is not touching those places, but your voice certainly is.
Yeah, it's been amazing. When I stepped away from the pulpit, I thought, what are you going to do? You've been sharing the message of Jesus your whole life. What are you going to do? And what I've realized in the last few months is I have spoken to more people in the last year than I probably spoke to in the 50 years I was pastoring. I've spoken to thousands of people all over the world in over 100 countries on every continent, which I would never have been able to do in person. And I think that was part of God's timing and delaying the writing of the book. 17 years ago, very little Facebook, very little internet, very little podcasting going on. And I think God's timing was perfect because he kind of planted this book at a time when it's very easy to promote it without spending your life savings on it. So that's good.
Well, tell us a little bit about the passage that you've brought to share today, and then read from your book so we can hear your tone and voice.
All right. What made the walk special? We thought when we first started, we thought the walk was going to be about the steps that we took. What we found very quickly was it wasn't about the steps at all. It was about the stops. The steps just connected the stops. And when we would stop to talk with someone about their life and get their story, it was just amazing how opportunities would then open themselves to pray with people, to encourage people, to speak to people. And in Winslow, Arizona, we met a Native American man who was standing at the Welcome to Winslow sign. And when we called out to him to talk to him, we realized he was crying. And so that starts the conversation here that I'd like to share with you. Just one of the most moving experiences that we had on the walk, I think. That day we had walked less than 10 miles total, yet the day had slipped away. By taking so much time with each of our encounters, the miles had accumulated slowly. We started back toward the truck stop where we had parked the van, and just across the street from the truck stop was a Welcome to Winslow sign and some sort of memorial with the United States flag. As we walked past it, we noticed a man standing at the flagpole with his back to us. We couldn't resist the opportunity for one last encounter of the day, and so we called up to the man. As he turned around, we realized that this was the first young man we had seen as we entered town, the one who had barely acknowledged our greeting. We also noticed he was crying. We began asking questions right away to see if there was anything we could do. Why are you crying? Is everything all right? We asked. I was just remembering, the young man replied. Rick, a Navajo, was standing between two beams from the World Trade Centers. He had been a part of the Navajo Job Corps sent to New York City to help clean up the site of the terrorist attacks. Rick's job had been to sift through the debris looking for the dead. I was just remembering what it was like to find someone, Rick confessed, with tears streaming down his cheeks. Rick shared about his life after his job in New York City. He was now homeless, living out of a backpack under interstate bridges. Our hearts broke again for a fellow American who had been treated so horribly and discarded so frequently by our society, except when they needed him to do something like sift through the rubble for dead bodies. I thought each time I heard a story like Rick's, I would be stronger. Maybe the next time I wouldn't be moved to tears. My heart wouldn't feel as though it had been ripped in two. But it never happened. Thank God, it never happened. We asked Rick if there was anything we could do for him. He said he was awfully hungry. Hunger is one thing I know how to fix. I knew the truck stop just across the street had a great buffet, so I offered to take Rick across the street for lunch. As we started across the street, Rick said, "They won't let me eat in there." "Why not?" I asked. "Because I'm homeless and because I'm an Indian." Rick's head was down again now. I've lived a life virtually void of prejudice, which is why I was totally unprepared for what was about to happen. "Well, let's just go see." We walked into the truck stop and up to the cashier. I told her I wanted to buy my friend Rick the buffet for lunch. While I reached for my wallet, she reached for one of those white styrofoam to-go boxes. She said she was sure Rick would want to have his lunch to go. I'd never been sure what righteous indignation meant until that moment. I felt a lot more love and compassion for Rick right then than I did for the cashier. I tried to remain calm and not let my new friend see my anger. I informed the cashier he'd be eating in, just like everyone else, and I stayed until Rick was seated with his lunch and waved goodbye. When I left, I prayed for Rick and others like him in this country who have been treated less than human just because of the color of their skin or disability or their nationality. I felt sorry for him, but I felt even worse for people like the cashier who reach for the to-go boxes of life and never realize what they're doing. There would be more ahead like Rick, who were wanting to eat, waiting to be treated with dignity and love. Our nation was scattered with people, red, yellow, black, and even white, who find themselves discarded by society. Some live under bridges, some in rat-infested slums, and some even blend in the best they can in our own neighborhoods. We had begun praying early in the walk for God to give us the heart of Jesus, and it was happening every day with every step. People were capturing our hearts.
Oh, Rick, that's powerful. I always feel so helpless in so many situations, but I always know I can provide food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And a handshake and a hug. I mean, people, I think the basic need of people is to feel like they're being treated with dignity, like they're a real person, like they're a whole person. And there are so many people who don't get that every day. I was blessed. I was raised in a wonderful Christian family who showed their love and shared their love in an open way. And I'm thankful for that. But I encounter people every day who did not have that blessing. And sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do for someone is just give them a pat on the back and a smile. Sometimes you don't have to beat them over the head with a Bible. You just have to show them some love. And that's one of the things that the Walk Across America taught us, was that people just need to be loved. And we have the capacity to do that. But we're too busy most of the time. But when you're walking at 4 miles an hour or 3 miles an hour, you have time to do that. And that was the greatest blessing of the walk, I think.
That pastor I mentioned earlier said we need to preach every day, use words if you have to. So
yes, that's right.
I think people can see the way we live, and people just want to be seen. They just want to be acknowledged.
Yep, that's right.
Was there anything in your journals that didn't make the cut, that ended up on the cutting room floor? Was there anything that you had to edit out of the book?
Um, Not a lot that was terribly important. There was the journals were full of everyday experiences that were the same day after day after day. Um, you can only reinvent the way you walk 20 miles a day so many times. Of course, it varied with whether we were in a city or in the middle of the desert or where we happened to be. There was some variation, but there were almost no days that we didn't have some encounters. Even in the middle of the desert, it was amazing. People would drive up and ask us for directions. Of course, we had no idea. We were out on the highway walking. We didn't know, but that gave us an opportunity to share with people. So I think the book contains probably in some form, sometimes it's a very condensed form, but probably 80 or 85% of the people we met and the conversations we had, they're at least mentioned in the book in passing. And sometimes I grouped those together. If there were 3 or 4 people that were similar, their experiences were similar. We had several encounters with people who, once we began to talk with them, said, I feel like God called me to do something 10 years ago, and I've never had the courage to do it. And they would say, but if you can walk across America, then I believe I can start this church, or I believe I can do this thing that God's called me to do. So there are a lot of stories like that we kind of condensed into one. But I think most of the important things made it into the book. A lot of people have asked if there's going to be a sequel, and I thought, well, I'm not sure I left enough out. There'll be other books. I'm writing my dad's biography right now. My dad was a pastor for 55 years, a wonderful man who was born in Harlan County, Kentucky, also known as Bloody Harlan, coal mining country, the riots that happened there over the Union coming into the coal mines. He was born in the middle of all that at the end of the Depression, and he has a very colorful story. God called him to preach when he was 14. He moved to Cincinnati and began training for the ministry and met my mom there. And it's a glorious story. And he probably affected many more lives in his ministry than I have. God was just very gracious to him and allowing him. When we found out he was terminally ill, we had arranged for him to preach one last sermon. He had a brain tumor, so we didn't know how long he'd be able to preach. And so we invited people to that last sermon from every church he had pastored. And there was someone there that day from every church he had pastored except one that happened to be in New York and long distance away. But it was such a beautiful experience, and his life is very colorful. I've been talking with his sisters and brothers and getting stories from his childhood and collecting those. And so I hope by the end of the year that'll be published. But my dad's name was JC. He had no name, just initials. And so that's the name of the book. No name, just initials.
That's so poignant.
Yeah.
And I think you've gotten the method down now because you've become so prolific with your writing and writing your father's story. That's such a legacy to leave, not only to your family, but to everyone who knew him or who didn't know him, who will know him through this book.
Yeah. His parents were both illiterate. No education at all. My grandfather was a coal miner. Great grandfather was a coal miner. So nothing was ever written down. So everything we have is oral stories that we've heard and that he shared with us and that he told us as we were growing up, my sisters and I, and the ones we've gathered from my aunts and uncles. So it's a big task and it's a big chore, but it's very emotional for me, very, very hard. It's still very fresh. My dad died in 2011, but he was my mentor, my best friend, and we were very close in the ministry, and we had served on staff together. So it's a very emotional book for me to write, even more emotional than the book about the walk. And so I think it's going to touch a lot of people's lives.
I wish that we had recorded our grandparents and parents and their stories. I wish that we had their voices to hear all of those stories, because a lot of oral history does disappear And
Hmm.
unless we can write it down, it won't be around.
That's right. That's right. So that's one reason we wanted to write the book about the walk because, Jane and I are getting to the age, I'm 68, she'll be 70 next month. And we said, we're not going to be around forever. And if we don't write these stories down, they'll get lost. And the same with my dad's life. I'm the last generation that would have a tendency to, or any kind of desire to write his history down, write his story down. And so I want to make sure I get that done so that after I'm gone, that legacy is preserved in a way that other people can enjoy it for years to come.
That's so true. We're sending our legacies of our books out into the world, and they're going to certainly outlive us and be around for generations to come. So
Yes.
it's very, very important.
Yep. Really is. Really is.
What does writing success look like to you personally?
Um, Writing success to me, and this is a very personal thing, and I don't know how many other people would have this definition, but for me, success is when somebody writes us an email or comes up after a personal appearance and says, I read your book and it changed my life. I read your book and it has made a difference. And so many people have corresponded with us after reading the book and said, you know, I read this book because of this or because of that. I had one lady who posted a review on Amazon. She said, normally I don't read this genre of book, but she said, for some reason, I got it and I've read it. And I'm so glad I did because it has absolutely changed my life. And it's not me that does that, it's the story that does that. And it's the story of how God can take two very ordinary people who have no propensity to do something like walk across America and empower and encourage them and enable them to do that, which speaks volumes to anybody who's trying to find God's will for their life or the courage to do God's will, because what it speaks to them is, I can do this with God's help. I can do this. And so for me, success is when I understand and know that what I've written has changed a person's life for the better, whether it's a blog or an interview with a newspaper article or whether it's a book. It's all the same to me because as a pastor for 50 years, that's what success as a pastor meant to me. If I preached and no one was changed by what I preached, I felt like a failure. If I preached and it didn't touch anybody's heart, I thought, man, that was a wasted hour. But if you stand at the back to shake people's hand and they come out and say, Pastor, we read the children's book. I have to tell you this real quick. We read the children's book for a local school. They invited us to come and read the children's book to the second grades and third grade classes. And so we did. And after we did, the kids all came up and we handed out bookmarks to them and shook their hand and autographed their papers if they wanted. And this little boy came up to me, a third grade boy, and he had heard our story. We talked about the walk. We read the book. He came up to me and he said, I just want you to know you have challenged me to be the Christian that God's called me to be. This is a third grade boy. And I walked away with tears in my eyes because I said, God, if you can take this story and affect second graders and third graders. And my mother-in-law just passed away a couple of weeks ago. She was 92, Jane's mom. And in the last 6 months of her life, she read our book. And she just read little snippets at a time, but she finally made it all the way through the book. And it just was so encouraging to her. And I thought, from second grade to 92 years old, this story impacts people. And so if it impacts people, then it's a success. I'll never get rich doing this, that's for sure. But I hope that it's laying up some treasures in heaven, because that's really, all I ever desired for life is to one day when I stand before the Lord for him to say, well done, good and faithful servant. You didn't make millions. You didn't preach to tens of thousands, but you were faithful to do what I asked you to do. And man, if I hear those words, it's all worth it.
You and me both, brother. That's my desire as well.
Yep.
This has been a wonderful and rich interview with you today, Rick. And as always, our last interview question on Authors Over 50 is, our writers over 50 are a unique set. Do you have advice for writers 50 and above?
I do. And it's the same advice that I've heard so many people give. And that is, if you're passionate about writing, whatever you're writing, a book, a blog, or an article, whatever you're writing, write every day, every possible day, write something, even if it's a sentence or two. I've gotten into the habit since I wrote the first book of writing every day. And I set aside time. I teach college in the afternoons. I teach New Testament, Old Testament, church history. I have a blast doing it. I love college kids, but every morning I write. And so if you'll write every day, of course, my advice, if you're a person of faith, if you're a believer, my advice is I always pray first and say, God, I want to write the words that you want me to write today. And so I ask you to guide my fingers as I type these words, that they would be pleasing to you, that they would be the words that will encourage people. And I try to write something every day. Sometimes I write a chapter. Some days I write a paragraph. And I don't worry about that because I know it's all God's timing and it's all in his plan, and it will come together at the right time in the right way. And that's good. So just write. You'll get better as you write. I'm finding the second and third and fourth time around is easier than the first time. So just write.
That's certainly great advice for all of us today. We all need to be putting our seats in chairs and writing every day so that we can send those seeds out that you were planting every day. We may not live long enough to see those trees come to fruition, but the seeds are planted, and that's our legacy to the world. And you and Jane have led and are leading an extraordinary life, and we just thank you for your missions and your ministry and this wonderful walk across America where you inspired so many. And now we are excited to say, Rick, that you and Jane are counted among our authors over 50.
Thank you so much. Enjoyed being with you.
Thank you for joining us today. Please look for Authors Over 50 every Thursday when we will have conversations with accomplished debut novelists over the age of 50. Please subscribe and share with a friend. And check out my own publication journey after 50 at www.juliadaily, that's D-A-I-L-Y, like dailynewspaper.com. Until next time, keep reading and writing. And remember, it's never too late to fulfill a dream in life's sweetest third.